So I'm Elizabeth Sears, Betsy Sears. I'm chair of Department of History of Art, Western Medievalist. So I'm the outsider here who is but a friend and colleague of Marty who's introducing him before the keynote. And as the conference is now winding to its close and culmination, it's a good time again to thank JP and Carol, because I think now we can say it was a spectacular conference, a great success, very stimulating, very lavish all along the way, beautifully well organized. So I've learned a lot. I think it's a great thing. I'm, of course, honored as well as pleased to introduce Martin J. Powers, Sally Michelson Davidson, Professor of Chinese Art and Culture in the Department of History of Art at University of Michigan. Marty preceded me onto the faculty by just a few years. He came from UCLA to Michigan as an associate professor in 1988. I arrived in 1992. So we've together passed through several decades of local and national and global history, and we've met from time to time. Mani's is our favorite restaurant of late, to talk about contemporary politics as much as anything, but also about the histories of art of China and the West, looking for structural analogs and distinctions. When JP asked me to introduce Marty, I sort of said, oh, I don't know that that's appropriate. Oh, I don't know if I can give an adequate account of his impact in the field of Chinese art. So, at my request, JP sent around an email to those who could, namely Marty's doctoral students, a group I'm sure you all know who call themselves Martians. So the Martians responded with statements that are really quite beautiful, very much more informed than anything I will say. And so most of my introduction is going to be quotations from them. But first, I think it appropriate, almost just as a matter of dignity, to give a basic outline of his remarkable career, the barest outline, which will extend what was said yesterday at the opening. So Marty received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1978, arrived at Michigan, as I say, in 88, and was promoted to full professor in 1999, becoming, in that same year, the Sally Michelson Davidson Professor, an endowed professorship that will continue after his retirement, which is nice. So be thinking of who should be his successor. It'll probably happen in the nearish future. Marty, as it's even unnecessary to say, studies the role of the arts in relation to political action and social justice in imperial China. And this research has been supported by a whole slew of prestigious grants: Fulbright Hayes, CASVA, ACLS, Getty, Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, among them. His scholarship has been recognized by awards. Twice he received the Association for Asian Studies Joseph Levinson Book Prize for the Best Book in Chinese Studies pre-1900 category. First, as you all know, for Art and Political Expression in Early China, 1991, and then again for Pattern and Person, Ornament, Society, and Self in Classical China of 2006. And his third book is just out, and we're hoping it gets a prize. It's China and England, the Pre-Industrial Struggle for Justice in Word and Image. Marty has taken on important projects for making scholarship available to more general audiences. I think this is entirely admirable. With Dr. Catherine Chung, Kathy, who's sitting right around, there she is. You should be commended for your part in these publications and other things from University of Chicago. The two of them have co-edited Looking at Asian Art of 2006, and very, very difficult. These are horrible. The Blackwell Companion to Chinese Art, so much editing, so much work, of 2015. I'm really glad that the China Mirror project was mentioned, funded by the NEH, setting out to provide reliable sources for teaching Chinese history to undergraduates and even high school students just earlier on, which is wonderful. Marty has been a good citizen. He has, the CV reveals the great number of national and international boards he sat on, as well as work here at Michigan. Between 2000 and 2003, he directed the Center of Chinese Studies, now the chief sponsor of this wonderful conference. And it's important to emphasize, too, that his famed fluency in Chinese has meant that he has served as a bridge between academic cultures. He has done so much to connect up Anglophone and Chinese institutions. One of the many witnesses to the extent of his international circle is that conference last year, which I attended all of, very interesting. I imagine many of you were there. The Art Historical Art of Song China, a gathering of specialists from near and far to consider a scroll that may give evidence of the work of the legendary early Chinese painter Wang Wei. Marty has taught a whole range of courses with terrific titles like Painting and Poetry and Norman Storm, a lot on social justice for us. And as this conference is witness to, he has trained and mentored many a graduate student here and also in China. I've heard a lot of expressions of gratitude generally, and certainly in the last 2 days. Many speak of his intellectual stimulation, but also the way he's helped them to craft their arguments, the way he's been so generous in introducing them to scholars across the field. And we already saw evidence of the on-site visits to museums and other sites. A lot of that made possible by the existence of the Freer Fund, which has done so much to enable and enrich the study of Asian art here and at Michigan, and will continue to do so. And this all brings us directly to the Martians and to their messages. But I'll start with a non-Martian, and that is a Europeanist who was here when Marty arrived, who wrote, I quote, about a very young and a rebellious new voice in art history as he came. He recalled one episode, or it stuck in his mind, and that was the two of them meeting pretty early in the morning in the Fine Arts Library over in Tappan Hall, and both of them unshaven and looking a little worse for wear, having pulled an all-nighter. And Marty said to him, "It's a rat race." and the student said, "I don't know what the message is, but I think it's about hard work." But then he went on more sentimentally to say, that his real message was, it's a sign of Marty's breadth as a scholar and a teacher that many non-Chinese specialists like himself count Marty as among their most influential teachers, that Marty was an essential part of his education at Michigan. I had hoped that students would ruminate a little bit about Marty's publications and their impact, and they did. One former student said, and now it's a longish quote, when we discuss his publications, the obvious ones that have probably done most to change the field of Chinese art are his two Levinson Prize-winning books. But the one I return to over and over again is Discourses of Representation in 10th and 11th century China. That essay has so many important ideas in it, ideas about what similitude, naturalness, and artifice reveal, notions of how artistic style can relate to social identity, and a clear discussion of the poetry-painting relationship that considers how painters created visual metaphors and visual synecdoches, and how they used illusion in nuanced ways. Another wrote, of course, all of Marty's publications are worthwhile, and doubly so because I know I can count on them when assigning them to my students. The one that stands out most for me personally, however, is Character, Qi, and Gesture, Shi, in Early Chinese Art and Criticism of 1991. Not only is this brilliant essay worthy of study on its own merits, but also it was a unique and useful model when I was trying to puzzle out and how to understand that other Qi. His approach gave me courage, no little thing when one is a grad student, to expand de facto dictionary meanings into de jure contextual meanings. Another, I would say Professor Powers brings three important scholarly skills to his work: an understanding of the tools of literary theory, such as the analysis of rhetoric or discourse, an ability to connect societal structures, including governments and class frameworks, to art, and a commitment to very close visual looking in order to discern visual to societal connection. All of them recognized the intertwining of his life and work, not neglecting to mention Marty's appreciation for fine tea, but also saying, here's another, Marty is a true humanist. He not only admires, but also truly believes in the humanity embodied through the song, literary, sushi, and others, art and literature. These sentiments were reinforced in another remark. He is a true humanist and a public-minded scholar who in both life and work appreciates any effort of seeking justice and equality. And now I welcome Marty to the podium.
Well, thank you so much, Betsy and everyone. As you can imagine at this moment, I'm feeling a little grateful to many people, to everyone here in this room, and to the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, which has been embarrassingly generous with this, I think, as well as the Department of History of Art and the University of Michigan Museum of Art. I think this whole event is a testimony to JP's energy and ability and vision. It's incredible what he's been able to do. And he did it, of course, with Carol Stepanchuk's strong administrative skills supporting him. But I hope you'll forgive me if I just take a few moments to have an anti-Randian rant, and I hope maybe 5 minutes. And that is that I think people are a lot like cultures in this respect, in that no one it's very rare for someone really to accomplish much on their own, right? We all benefit from other people, which is just the opposite of what the Hegelian narrative tells us, right? That this nation did this by itself, and so I'm highly skeptical of that. If I think back on how fortunate I was explaining to some people last night, and I'll save you the details. Obviously, I was very lucky to be hired at UCLA as my first job. UCLA was one of the most global departments in the country and also one of the most progressive in the country. But the fact that I was hired actually had a lot to do with happenstance. There was more than a little crazy chance involved in that. So I was just very lucky about that. Likewise, I grew up in South Chicago in a underprivileged area. And for a kid from there to take on Chinese culture could not be easy. Again, I was most fortunate to befriend and later to marry Amy Ma, who introduced me to the mysteries of the Orient and helped me negotiate China in 1980 at a time when it was still basically Maoist. I don't think I would have gotten very far without that. And likewise, very fortunate to come to the University of Michigan, where I've learned a lot from my colleagues over the past 30 years, and from colleagues not at the University of Michigan, many of them in this room. So I think that's an important point I want to underscore. And perhaps some of this, and finally, and most importantly, I was really, really fortunate, close to 10 years ago, to meet my wise and wonderful partner, Kathy Jiang, who has edited books with me. And also when she's not pioneering digital humanities for the field of Chinese art history, which she has done in an exemplary way, she helps me keep my feet on the ground and my head on my shoulders. And she advised me not to make this talk overly complicated. So I'm hoping, I don't know if I've succeeded. She'll tell me when I'm done. Okay. So yeah, this issue of privacy, again, here we go. I was having bubble tea with Joan Key, my colleague, and we agreed that currently privacy may be the most important and perhaps dangerous factor in relation to democracy today. Certainly a very, very important topic. And I want to deal with that a little bit today. My not-so-hidden agenda, that the study of history, and especially as we know that most useless of disciplines, the history of art, can actually help us to understand some features of current concern that we might have missed had we not looked back in time. So David Holtzman, former security analyst and military codebreaker, talks about history. He tells us people in feudal societies had little privacy. In a democracy, privacy makes possible freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and so on. Totalitarian societies have one thing in common: lack of real privacy and therefore lack of dignity. Now, I think that some classic social theorists like Henry Maine, Karl Marx, and Raymond Williams, in general, would probably agree with that. Maine characterized the shift from pre-modern to modern as the evolution away from inherited status to independence. Marx saw the transition as away from feudal dependence toward independence, and Raymond Williams understood the shift as relating to the increasing consciousness that social position is made rather than merely inherited. Now, we find this process taking place, actually, both in the post-Enlightenment period and following the Tang Song transition. In addition, we find that expertise, reason, and facts more and more was able to trump social status and dogma. It's also at these moments that anonymity and privacy become objects of intellectual debate and legislation, which is what I'll be talking about today. Do I have a laser pointer? That's all right. This is a detail, by the way, from a painting of the garden at Shugborough, Lord Anson's garden at Shugborough. He placed classical ruins and a Chinese philosopher's pavilion together as a part of a common sentiment at the time, actually, that the sources of the Enlightenment could be found both in China and in the classical world. He also, in his dining room, he also has busts of Greek philosophers, and among them is Confucius. Now, apart from these familiar binaries, dependent, independent, or worth birth, I would suggest there may be a more fundamental distinction between this before and after, and that is that in ranked societies, a person's suitability for either appointment or punishment can be predicted from the social group they belong to in this ranked hierarchy. Whereas in meritocratic systems, or what S.N. Eisenstadt calls bureaucratic societies, a person's suitability for appointment or punishment normatively cannot be predicted on the basis of group membership, but must be determined by an examination of facts particular to that individual. So I'm sure almost everyone in this room has a pretty good idea what a ranked society is like. And certainly China wasn't the only one, but let's talk about classical China as a quick example. So in classical China, society was segmented, people being divided into separate hereditary groups, with each group occupying a different level of the social hierarchy. Higher-ranking groups had more privileges, and political authority was understood and exercised as privilege. Your status level would be marked, for example, by the number of bells you had, or by the degree of ornamentation. And the term used was degree, tu, which also meant social status, just as in Elizabethan England. In this system, one could predict who was suitable for exercising authority simply by determining which group the person belonged to. Well, early bureaucratic theorists like Mozi and later followers maintained you could only develop an effective administration if you made appointments without regard to lineage, wealth, or other personal qualities. All that counted was how you performed in office. This meant two things. First of all, when you remove group membership, you get individuals. That's all an individual is. It's someone who is being considered by the state without regard to group membership. Secondly, individuals are unpredictable. They must be examined for personal talents or abilities or evidence of wrongdoing in order to determine appointment or punishment. And it's just at this time, around the 3rd century BCE, maybe a bit earlier, that terms for public and private appear in Chinese bureaucratic theory. Public referring to actions that concern the state, either performance in office or criminal behavior. Private referred to everything else that was not of interest to the state. By Han times, that included lineage, wealth, national origin, or even your previous criminal record. These terms, by the way, get translated in the 1730s into French and English, but that's another story. So to make it clear as a diagram, basically in a more ranked system, it's not that people don't have individual talents, knowledge, and experience. Of course they do. That never disappears. But the ruling authority only sees the group, and public and private are collapsed into group identity. What this means is that it doesn't mean that the individual parts disappear. They don't disappear. They are simply denied. And this creates a rupture between fact and ideology, with the latter becoming a fantasy promoted by privileged groups. And I think what Tim's comments just before lunch today relate to this, because basically by denying these facts, by suppressing them, you necessarily create a fantasy which then must be, people have to become complicit with. Again, in Eisenstadt's bureaucratic society, the group identities are not denied and they're not ignored. It's simply that the state is not interested in those things. So those things become your private life, and for example, your religion. Whereas public life, those things the state is interested in have to do, again, with what you can contribute to your job or to a crime, what you've done in the way of crime. And these can be reversed. So whenever the state penetrates into an individual's group life or private life, privacy disappears, leaving nothing but group identity. Since groups are always ranked, then next thing you know, you've got the old system. Now, did the rise of bureaucratic theory accompany any interest in personal privacy? Possibly. Let's just look at some of the evidence. In China and later in England, surveillance first appears, it would seem, as a means of suppressing negative feedback against the authorities. Privacy and political expression were linked from the beginning. A good example is China's first tyrant. Most of you are familiar with Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. If he was China's Hitler, then King Li was China's Stalin. In the 5th century BCE, he was infamous not only because he had his critics assassinated, but just as important because he had a network of spies who would go around and listen to see who was complaining about the king, and then he would have them. Yeah, I could see Howard is smiling. It's a familiar story here, right? So he was considered, just the acme of tyranny. Now, in bureaucratic theory, it's actually in general, not always, but in general, feedback came more and more to be valued as a corrective. So in this text from the 3rd century BCE, we get the 3 stages of political collapse. This might be useful. Take it down. When a government slanders the best people, that is called ruthless. When the most capable men flee the country, that is called in collapse. When the people do not dare to criticize or complain, that is called excessive use of force. This is the most extreme form of turmoil. This is out of control. Now, we have some recent studies suggesting that, or casting state surveillance as theft, as a form of theft. Well, Xunzi actually has a similar approach. He combines together privacy and property, and he thinks that this is something that belongs to people that governments cannot legitimately take. He starts out complaining about excessive taxes, which he sees as actually theft, stealing people's food or valuables. And then he goes on to say, and they spy on people too, and they entrap them, and presumably they use that evidence or false evidence against their critics and so on. But when the people come to their senses, they will know of their ruler's wanton tyranny, and then the throne will be in grave danger. You may notice that I'm using other people's translations and also my own, and I'm doing that deliberately so you know that I'm not skewing the translations, okay? we're getting other people are saying the same thing. If we go to the medieval period and the famous Zen poet Han Shan, I think he also refers to this. This is a beautiful translation by Red Pine. It's also an accurate one. Seems to be he's probably talking about spies. They scrutinize the worldly affairs. They want all the details. They weigh nothing lightly and love to gain an edge. Defending themselves, bad becomes good. Attacking others, right becomes wrong. Thus we hear their flattering tongues. Behind his back, it's all his fault. But hot and cold, that is the facts, I'll judge for myself. Why should I trust the lips of slaves? Now, this, both in the Xunzi and in this text, whether or not this is about spying, we sense a kind of disgust. And you wonder, is this peculiar to classical China or medieval China? There was a Harvard study where they went around and they explained to people what it was that Facebook was doing with their personal information. And the result in a large number of individuals was a sense of revulsion or disgust. The article that explains this says there's something unnatural about the kind of targeting that's become routine in the ad world. This Harvard paper suggests something taboo, a violation of norms we consider inviolable. But still, I'll let you decide for yourself what Han Shan was saying. I think we're on more solid ground when we get to the issue of anonymity, which definitely gets legislated in Song times by the 11th century. Holtzman again tells us freedom of speech is easier to exercise behind a shield of anonymity. Anonymity makes retribution harder. That's why when we vote, it's supposed to be anonymous, and constrains arguments to logic because other people don't know what group you belong to, so they can't vilify your group. Oh, thanks. 11th century laws in China allowed taxpayers, including women, including maids, to blow the whistle at the grievance offices, and I've read some of these cases myself. They're quite interesting. In one case, a maid charged a chancellor, and the DOI, the Department of Investigation, went after him, and they brought him down. This is just a passage from the edict in 1017 that establishes this office. Civil and military officials, as well as educated and ordinary taxpayers, may expose faults with policies issued from the imperial court, conflicts between public and private interest, which meant corruption, and military and security matters, and a bunch of other things. Now, complaints made to the grievance office could be made anonymously. Susher tells us this. So it was protected in the grievance offices if you wanted it. Also, officers were instructed not to inquire as to the complainant's social status. That is to say, your group membership was not significant. They just wanted the facts. Anonymity, of course, was protected in civil service exams, and this was very important for breaking the hold that certain groups may have had on official positions, because it eliminated information about the candidate's social class, ethnicity, religion, or other private matters. For those of you who don't know, I think most of you do, you entered a cubicle, they searched you for crib sheets, and you just wrote your answers, and after you finished your exam, they replaced your name with a number, and then your exam was copied by scribes, so they couldn't even tell from the handwriting if you were upper class or lower class. And there were 5 graders, at least in Song times, or part of the time, and the grades were average. So it was difficult. There's a way to probably to rig any system, but it must have been hard. And again, for most of late imperial China, not always, taxpayers could choose their own religion. Again, the state didn't consider that to be its business, and we find this in works of art like this. This is a fan painting, and as we recall from Wang Gerei earlier, that fan paintings could reflect your views on public issues. So we have a Confucian scholar, a Buddhist monk, and a Taoist adept, all in a neutral situation out in nature discussing ethical questions. We also had ecumenical academies where scholars of these different traditions could discuss ethical issues together. I don't know if there were many. I know of at least one. Now, but did anyone ever complain about transgressions of privacy, that someone invaded my privacy? This comes up in relation to this painting, which Wu Hong has written about brilliantly in his double screen. And Deneen Lee also has published a book on this. But I'm just going to focus on this issue. My personal view is that this painting is likely dating around 1100, but then the original was done in the 10th century. Han Shizai, a high-ranking statesman, had started holding very raucous parties singing girls, courtesans, and so on. And the emperor heard of this, and so he dispatched a painter. They didn't have cameras in those days that you could put in your lapel, so he dispatched a painter to go to the parties, commit things to memory, and then paint it. So here we see these are courtesans. There's a couple in bed tussling around under the blankets. You see that? And this younger servant girl is curious what's going on, and this older courtesan blocks her view. She doesn't want her to lose her innocence quite yet. But the interesting thing is this painting was recorded in the imperial catalog of around 1100. Now, normally, the author of that catalog talks about style or subject matter or tradition or whatever. In this case, he castigates Li Houju for ordering this painting to be made. To go so far as to have his minister's private indiscretions recorded for his own perusal is excessively to indulge his own curiosity, much like Emperor Huan's inquiring about Zhang Chang applying his wife's eyebrow pencil. In such cases, the ruler has already transgressed proper form. And then he goes on to say, but then to make it public and let other people see it, this was totally over the line. But what we're interested in here is Zhang Chang, because he's using this as sort of like our Hitler argument. In other words, everybody would know that in Zhang Chang's case, this was illegitimate. The emperor should not have done this. So let's see what that's all about. This takes place during the Han Dynasty, during Huan Di's reign. Zhang Chang was mayor of Luoyang, and there was good order, but the emperor got word that Zhang applied his wife's eyebrow pencil for her. Maybe a bit kinky, but, you know, it's romantic too. All the town gossiped about how charming were his wife's brows. The emperor inquired with him about this, but he replied, Your Majesty, I have heard that in the inner chambers, in the private moments between husband and wife, more intimate things go on than painting eyebrows. His Majesty did not pursue the matter. Shen Kuo gives us an actual legal case, and I thank my lawyer daughter for helping me with this. Previously, a certain Zhao Tian from Caozhou collected dirt on people, and he started blackmailing them. And he was able to blackmail and terrorize the entire neighborhood. But Xie Tao, an assistant officer in the Ministry of Defense, was assigned to Caozhou. Xie got to the bottom of this nasty business, apprehended the officer, and wrote a memo detailing the entire monstrous affair from beginning to end. Now, notice that Xie Tao is a lower-level military officer. He hands this over to the civil administration because they had jurisdiction. As soon as this document was submitted, it was taken up by the Department of Investigation for further action. Because of the heinous nature of the crime, Zhao was executed in the market. The people of Caozhou all congratulated themselves on their liberation. You know what this means, obviously. It means that the DOI did not take all that dirt that they must have had, right, and follow it up, right? He had evidence on lots of people. Some of them had committed crimes. They didn't take that up. Otherwise, they wouldn't have felt liberated. And moreover, following this, we now have the law prohibiting the instigation of legal action regarding other people's affairs. And again, my daughter helped me with the language here. Huo Cunfu has written a whole article on this case, so this is based on his research. According to this new law, plaintiffs would have no standing in cases in which they were not materially involved. So in other words, for example, if you learned that your neighbor was reading the Koran, something that might pique the interest of our officials, and you took that to the magistrate, your case could be thrown out of court because it's got nothing to do with you. Now, this is not an isolated case. About a century later or more, in his list of instructions to subordinates, Zhen Dexiu refers to a similar legal principle. And here I'm using Brian McKnight's translation. He's one of the leading scholars of Song law. This is the 6th of 10 scourges that officials illegally impose on the people. The 6th is inviting accusations. Accusations lead to the deterioration of customs and social relations. While offenders naturally should be punished strictly, how is it permissible to invite people to go around accusing other people? Obviously, you could get a lot of false accusations. People would be incentivized to do this. You'd have a McCarthyite situation or Cultural Revolution situation where social relations would break down. At the present time, some officials will accept sealed plaints that make accusations without anyone even being aware that they've been accused. Or they will post public notices calling on people to expose crimes committed in secretly. These are unlawful and should not be done. And this is very, very similar reasoning to the other law I mentioned to you. On the other hand, it was perfectly legal for any taxpayer to lodge an anonymous complaint against an official, all right? That was okay, because officials have to be held to a higher standard. But officials couldn't do that with taxpayers. Finally, the fifth of Zhen Duxiu's scourges was rounding up suspects en masse rather than limiting apprehension to those who have reason to believe are guilty, a rule similar to the prohibition of general warrants that I'll talk about in a little bit in England. Finally, it's interesting to know that Zhen Duxiu previously wrote a famous policy document, which also was translated into French and English, on the critical role of public opinion in the governance of the state. He excoriated the former Chancellor Wang Anshi, who, contrary to custom, had suppressed dissent. Zhen treated this as the very acme of tyranny. I think they're related. His attitude toward public opinion and his attitude toward privacy are closely related. Finally, this is the last China case. We find a philosophical justification for privacy in the work of Lu Zuxian, who I don't think has been translated yet. At least I'm unaware of any English translation. But he has a long essay on greed and parsimony. And he concludes this way. He says, if you pursue the matter to its logical end, there is nothing in nature you can do away with. Within the heart of man, there is no thought that should be forbidden. How should it be possible that greedy or stingy thoughts could be eradicated? How would you accomplish that? How should that possibility exist? But the fact is that while actions may be good or bad, thoughts are without good or evil. It is only when a thought leads to good actions that we call it a good thought. And when a thought augments bad actions, we call it a bad thought. Both originally are merely thoughts. In origins, there is no difference. The unspoken premise here is that it is not possible to predict from the thought itself, much less from group membership, whether a thought will actually lead to a criminal act. And that, therefore, it's beyond the state's concern. Now let's go to England. From liberty to privilege to liberty as freedom. Speaking of translation and not mentioning the standard of analysis, in China they typically translate liberty, say from the Magna Carta or Montesquieu, as 自由, as freedom. That's not what it meant. It meant privilege. And we see this in Edmund Burke. We have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, aristocracy, and a House of Commons and a people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties, privileges from a long line of ancestors. Liberties were inherited, and you got different liberties depending on the status of your ancestors. In this society, people were divided into different hereditary groups, with each group occupying a different rung of the social hierarchy. Higher-ranking groups had more privileges, and political authority was understood and exercised as privilege. François Furet, again, expresses this nicely. After the revolution, the aristocratic notion of liberty, the protection of privilege at every level, was superseded by a democratic one. But before that, you had the aristocratic notion of liberty. Now, what we want to look at is how you change from one to the other. During the 1720s and 30s, the free thinkers questioned the notion that political authority should be determined by privilege. Robert Walpole was the Chancellor of England at that time, and nepotism and cronyism were both common and perfectly legal. For example, he might name his son-in-law to go and be ambassador or give him some ministerial post. That was perfectly legal in those days. But beginning in the 20s, Walpole came in for extensive criticism from men such as Eustace Budgell, Edward Cave, James Roberts, Samuel Johnson, and other free thinkers. Now, what did all these men have in common? What they had in common was a mammoth translation project of J.B. Dodds' description of China. We have it here in special collections. It's about that big, 2 volumes, very thick. And it included a section which translated these policy documents I mentioned earlier written in Chinese during the Han, Song, and later dynasties. Of course, they weren't doing the translating. There were other translators, but they were all involved in the collation and the editing and so on, including Samuel Johnson. And Edward Cave, in his preface, says that the declarations, edicts, and policy documents from the Chinese may be affirmed to be as noble essays upon liberty and government as ever appeared in any country of Europe, not excepting Great Britain itself, on the rights, the common rights of mankind on this side of the globe. Now, here, liberty and rights are not referring to rights that are specific to a particular status group, because he says the Chinese have it and the English have it and we all have it, and he says nothing about different status groups, right? So this is one of the earliest instances I've found. If you know an earlier one, please let me know. But this is the earliest one I found where liberty and rights are used in a more modern sense. This is a passage from one of the policy documents that appears early on, and which Samuel Johnson heartily recommended. He recommended that whole section on policy documents. Formerly, officers and teachers would speak or challenge the ruler's errors. Ordinary people would criticize from the roads, and merchants or travelers would denounce government from the markets, so that the ruler would hear of his faults. To hear one's faults and then to reform, to listen to reasonable criticism and to follow it, this is the way to preserve the empire for all time. Empire is their word. Indeed, there were 2 edicts passed by Wendy and his cabinet protecting this kind of criticism. And later Han writers take it for granted, so it wasn't all hot air. So John Wilkes and liberty. With the aid of Lord Richard Grenville Temple, John Wilkes became a member of the House of Commons. Who was John Wilkes? You'll find out in a moment, but he would have been a young man during the 30s and 40s when these documents were very popularly read by the freethinkers and critics of Walpole. Wilkes was also a strong critic of Walpole and corruption in the English government, so it's hard to imagine he was unfamiliar with these documents. In the North Britain, a publication supported by Temple, Lord Temple, Wilkes published essays highly critical of corrupt government and gained a strong following among the emerging public. In number 45, publishing anonymously, he always did, he openly criticized the king, something that Emperor Wen's edicts and the Duald essays had declared necessary and legal, but no one in England had ever tested the idea. He was immediately arrested. Seeing as Wilkes was a member of Parliament, the judge would not sign a warrant without evidence, so the authorities obtained a general warrant that allowed them to round up anyone associated with Wilkes. 1764, the authorities broke into Wilkes' home to collect evidence they could use against him. That is, without a warrant. They only had a general warrant. Wilkes was accused of treason and imprisoned, but as he was a member of Parliament, again, he had the liberty or the right, that is the privilege, of being tried in Parliament. And he begins by appealing to the king and telling the king, well, I know you're a defender of liberty, but what the king meant by liberty was not what Wilkes meant by liberty. The king meant privilege, and Wilkes meant general rights that everyone has, as we'll see. This had become a cause célèbre, so we begin to get prints like this portraying Wilkes as a hero vis-a-vis his detractors. You could also see signs on pubs that were supportive of Wilkes, punch bowls, tea caddies, all kinds of things were being made. Talk about material culture. It's a bit like what Garay was talking about. People were buying objects that allowed them to indicate that we support Wilkes. It's when he gets around to the general warrants that his understanding of liberty becomes clear. And in reference to that, he says, such inhuman principles of star chamber tyranny will, I trust, by this court, upon this solemn occasion, be finally extirpated, and that henceforth every innocent man, however poor and unsupported, may hope to sleep in peace and security in his own house, unviolated by the king's messengers and the arbitrary mandates of an overbearing Secretary of State. Wilkes was very influential in America. Jefferson didn't care for him. I won't bore you with the details. But Paul Revere was very much influenced. And when they were having trouble with the British, Revere cast this bowl, Wilkes and Liberty, number 45. Mentions the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and here we see a torn certificate of general warrants. Arthur Cash, who wrote a book on Wilkes in 2006, notes, following public outcry over the messenger's arresting of 49 people when they were searching for only 3, general warrants would be outlawed. Indignation over the seizure of papers would lead to suits that establish the rights of privacy and have been treasured in American and English law and in the past decade whittled away. And of course, you remember John Daciot had pointed to a law that was very similar. Just to remind you, in case you haven't read it, I'm sure you all have, Fourth Amendment, which Cash believes was very much informed by the Wilkes case. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, that's not too different from Wilkes' language, shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. In other words, you can't just have a general warrant say we might have some terrorists in the room. You've got to search everybody. Now, Thomas Jefferson is involved in this also, as you might imagine. And first of all, I want to point out that his notion of democracy, I would argue, was meritocracy. In his bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, he says, whence it becomes expedient for promoting the public happiness that those persons whom nature hath endowed with genius and virtue, which meant talent and concern for the public good. Virtue was had a very specific meaning at that time, which was related to the Chinese translations, because that's what de meant, and they translated it as virtue, should be rendered by liberal education worthy to receive and able to guard the sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of their fellow citizens, and that they should be called to that charge without regard to wealth, birth, or other accidental condition or circumstance. Does that sound familiar? Have we heard that before, that you should be called to your office without reference to wealth or birth? We saw that in Maudza. We see it, of course, in the civil service examination. I don't think he got it from Maudza. I don't think he knew anything about Maudza. But again, if you're trying to break the grip of group on power, this is the best way to do it. Finally, Thomas Jefferson and freedom of conscience. The error seems not sufficiently eradicated that the operations of the mind, as well as the acts of the body, are subject to the coercion of the laws. In modern English, we would say the error is not sufficiently eradicated that the operations of the mind, as well as the acts of the body, should be subject to the coercion. In other words, the acts of the mind should not be subject to the coercion of the laws. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. Again, it reminds me a bit of not having standing, right? Because if my neighbor thinks I have 20 gods, well, what's that got to do with me? I have no standing there. And again, he's not getting the idea from China in that case. And again, it reminds us a bit of Li Zuqian. Actions may be good or bad, but thoughts are without good or evil, right? Not all that different in sentiment. Finally, we can see that for thousands of years, surveillance has been related to the problem of free speech, and there's lots of data on that now. A lot of people don't feel comfortable being watched, in 13 countries anyway. I should say, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I know nothing about mass data, but I suspect it's harmless or even beneficial when limited to business or marketing, healthcare, other public needs. In fact, it's essential. It's not like we can get rid of this. But when applied to appointment or punishment, or the use of public services, like getting on an airplane, it can lead to segmentation of population into ranked groups. This may then encourage the false assumption that people's actions can be accurately predicted from group membership, a group that might have been based on your Facebook friends, for example. As an example, at the football match at the Welsh capital, they used some of this software to try to pick out terrorists, and they came up with 2,470 potential matches, and 92% of them were false positives. Okay. And of course, others have noticed this. This is actually not the subject of my talk, though. You can do with this information as you want. My point is that these issues are not peculiar to the present. These issues go back. They go way back. And it has to do with creating ranked groups, with organizing society according to ranked groups, and ignoring the individual. Zhuangzi, a brilliant philosopher of the 4th century BCE, understood this. He maintains that originally everyone was equal in society because there were no groups. He literally says this. He says there were no groups. And so then how do we get groups? He says it was those philosophers and the craftsmen who divided people into classes using their skills. Of course, you don't need ceremonial bells to rank people in groups. You can do it with digital. You can do it digitally just as easily. Finally, by Sung times, Chinese intellectuals seem to have grasped the idea that the real root of freedom precisely is in the unpredictability of the individual. And happily, Xin Qiji wrote this poem about retirement. And we've seen this earlier, and he refers to Tao Yuanming's famous poem about retirement, and he does kind of a play on it. And so I thought I'd share this with you. I thought I'd climb the tower tall to hide away from sorrow, but sorrow only followed me to the top of that tall tower. I've roamed about wherever I go, the country seems to have changed. So many of my kin and friends have grown old and gray. Come home and rest. Rest and come home. Must you be a duke before you're called a man? The rise and dip of wandering clouds you never could predict. When you come to be like wandering clouds, that, my friend, would be freedom. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for a fantastic talk, and this actually concludes the official program of the conference, and thank you all for attending this long 2-day conference. Thank you.